Good evening. This is Faith Matters, and I am David Hennessy. Today, I have with me in the studio a man who, by losing everything, found everything. A man who, having been broken to the edge of death, found himself miraculously reborn to a new life. David Parks was making his mark as a professional soccer player, first with Bohemians and then with Waterford. Football was the love of his life. However, his career was cut short when he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. He found a new career as lead singer of a popular band, and for years he fought a losing battle with Crohn's disease, but following his 9th major surgery, was given just weeks to live. This is when God came into his life in a big way.
So, David, it's a joy having you here. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Dublin down here to Wexford.
My pleasure indeed, David. The last time we met was a lot further away.
It was indeed.
It was indeed. Cancun was the first time that we set eyes on one another.
It's amazing what the Lord does.
Absolutely.
He does amazing things. David, well, I'd like to ask you to tell us your story.
Well,
starting at the beginning.
Yeah, well, at the beginning, I was born in Dublin. My dad was a postman by day. He was a musician by night. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but all her family were all Ireland dancers. They all loved to dance and they could all sing. I have an older sister, a younger brother, and then 2 younger sisters. Beautiful family. We didn't have a lot monetary-wise, but spiritually we were multimillionaires. My first love in life was soccer. I played schoolboy soccer from the age of 11, and it was my life up to the age of 27 years of age. At the age of 17, I played League of Ireland soccer. I started off with St. Patrick's Athletic, and then I went and joined Drogheda, and then turned professional with Bohemians in 1969. That's when Bohemians turned professional. We won a FAI Cup medal in the season 69-70. We beat Sligo Rovers. 2 years later, I had the great privilege of playing against Pelé, which was my claim to fame. But having said that, not just did I play against Pelé, but I played against Bobby Charlton and with Bobby Charlton, because when I finished up in Waterford in 1977, Bobby Charlton came and played with us for 6 weeks. And what a joy. He was a pure gentleman. And then I had obviously played against Manchester United, which George Best was part of as well. 1977, I developed an illness called Crohn's disease. It plagued my life for 14 years.
What is Crohn's disease?
Crohn's disease is a cousin of colitis. And in those days, they used to say that colitis was cancerous and that Crohn's disease wasn't cancerous, but they've since discovered that it can turn cancerous. So it's a disease of the bowel. Starts off like with either can be constipation or diarrhea. It can be either one or the other. Excruciating pain and vomiting. So I had it for 14 years and I had 10 major surgeries. 10
surgeries?
Yeah. So I had my 9th surgery was on Christmas Eve 1988. And then I had my last surgery on Christmas Eve of the following year, 89. And after the 9th surgery, which went on for 11 hours, they said there was nothing they could do for me. That, in their opinion, it was just a matter of time. And I remember when the doctor told me that, I remember starting to cry. And, I wasn't crying out of pity for myself. The reason I was crying was because I have 3 children. Lorna is the eldest, and then Ken. But Ken was born in 1975, and he was born with cystic fibrosis. And I was the only breadwinner in the house. We had a younger boy later called Gary. So when I was told that life was up, it was only a matter of time, the worry was who's going to take care of Anne and the kids? Because Anne hadn't worked since Ken was born. He needed so much attention. So after a day of feeling sorry for myself, I decided, listen, I better put on a brave face for the rest of the family. So things were very difficult financially. At that time, I was a professional musician. I had to give up the football because of the Crohn's disease and then fell into the music. And if you're a professional musician, if you don't work, you don't earn any money. And because over a 6-year period of time of being in hospital, recuperation, back in work for a month or two, and then the whole procedure start all over again. But the band that I had in the Burlington Hotel decided to run a concert in the Green Isle Hotel, of which I didn't want to participate in because I was 99 pounds in weight. I looked like death warmed up. I was stooped over. I couldn't stand up straight. And I would know probably 90% of the people who were going to turn up for this concert. And I suppose it was a bit of pride, I don't want them to see the way I am. So the band sent a car around. Anne and I appeared at the concert. It was magnificent. They had all Joe Cuddy, Ronan Collins, Dickie Rock, Brendan Boyer. All of these people turned up at the concert because they knew, well, I was a musician, and the word had spread that life was practically extinct.
They gave you 2 weeks to live?
Roughly 4 weeks, they said. Roughly 4 weeks, yeah. So when we arrived at the concert, the place was absolutely packed. And then we had not just had we got my own band from the Burlington, but we also had a big band, a 16-piece big band. And, of course, they inveigled me to sing, which I didn't want to, but they were probably thinking this could be the last time this guy will ever sing. So as I'm on the stage, stooped over, looking down over the ballroom in the Green Isle Hotel, I see Joe Cuddy, Lord rest him, Brendan Boyer, all of these, Dickie Rock, and their arms around one another, and they're all crying. Tears, because as they told me afterwards, we never thought we'd see you alive again. That was how bad it was. But the amazing thing was there were 2 people there at the concert that night. 2 people who had an involvement in Medjugorje. One was a lady called Heather Parsons, and the other was a guy called Harry Dixon. Heather, they ran a travel agency called Medjugorje Pilgrimages. And part of their remit was that they would hold a few seats on their charter, and they would give it to people who they thought may never get to Medjugorje, and this would be one way of supporting them. So Harry told me all about this place called Medjugorje, which, strangely, I knew about. And the reason I knew about Medjugorje was Anne and I were married in 1972. And we were to go to Ibiza on our honeymoon, and I was playing for Bohemians. And 2 weeks before we were married, I was in town, and of course I meet 6 of the guys off the team. And they said, "Hey, Parksy, you'll have to come on a holiday with us." And I said, "Where are you going?" They said to me, "We're going to Ibiza." And that's where Anne and I were due to go on a honeymoon. So I said, "When are you going?" He said, "Oh, Parksy, we're going on the 17th of June, which was the day that Anne and I were going." So obviously they were going to be in Medjugorje or in Ibiza, as Anne and I were. So I said, this is not going to work. So the following day, I went up to Anne's home, and of course I didn't word things properly. I said to her, "Anne, I've got a problem." And Anne thought, "Oh God, cold feet, he's running away." Started to cry and said, No. The difficulty is, I told her about the team, and she said, "Well, I'm not going to Ibiza to be a widow on my honeymoon." So during the week we went into Sunbound, was the travel agency in Dawson Street, and we went in there, explained the situation, that we didn't want our money back. We didn't want to be where 6 footballers were who I knew. So we said, "Can you recommend anyone?" They said, "Listen, we're getting great reports about Yugoslavia. Anybody who's been there think it's amazing and they want to go back." And they said, "It's a little place called Saftat." So we did 2 weeks of absolute bliss, and we came home. And so Yugoslavia, and subsequently Croatia, as Saftat was. Over the subsequent years, when it appeared in the papers that Our Lady had appeared in Mostar, just close to Mostar in Medjugorje, we knew that it was close to so I knew what was happening. So the difficulty was I didn't want to go to Medjugorje because God and I were at loggerheads. And I was born Catholic, raised Catholic, practiced. Then Ken was born, and then I couldn't come to terms with Ken's illness. Ken was born with cystic fibrosis. And I just could not come to terms with it. Because at the time I was a professional soccer player, was playing against all these players with the trappings of success, and I just couldn't believe it. But then things got worse then, because he needed so much attention, and I felt, men were stupid. Anne is giving him all this attention and I'm not getting any. So unfortunately, Anne and I, I left her twice. But Anne had a great ability to forgive. And she forgave me what happened, inviting me back to the family home, and thank God we're still together. So we ended up, when we were talking to Harry about Medjugorje, he kept saying to me, "Oh, no, Our Lady's appearing." And I said, "I have no interest. God is not part of my life. Why would I want to go? And it's, I have no interest." And then he'd go on another tangent, and I'd say, "Listen, Harry, I told you, I have no interest." Now I'm getting angry because I'm feeling sick. I'm sore. After the last surgery. And then out of sort of desperation, he says, "Look, David, on the way home from Medjugorje, we'll stop at a little place you've never ever heard of before, called Savtat. And in Savtat, we're going to have the most glorious meal and mass." And I smiled. And he said to me, "What are you smiling about?" And then, of course, I told him about Anne and I getting married and that we'd spent our honeymoon in Savtat. And I said to him, "Harry, look, we'll have none of the mass stuff in Savtat, none of it. But the thoughts of having dinner in Savtat is too great to refuse." So the only reason I went to Medjugorje was for a meal in Savtat on the way home from Medjugorje.
And tell me, you said you and God weren't getting on.
No.
Would you go into that and tell us about your son, Ken? Because you said he was born with cystic... Was he born with cystic fibrosis?
Yeah.
And what is cystic fibrosis?
It's a genetic difficulty. They're minus one gene, and that gene is responsible for the respiratory system and the digestive system. So at the time, when we were told in a roundabout way, Christmas Eve 75. God, I'm a bit like Ronnie Corbett. I'm all over the place, so I'm sorry. But at Christmas Eve 75, Ken was just 6 months old. He was in hospital. Brought in Christmas Eve. I was summoned from my job and was told that he has only 3 hours to live. But I was to go home, pick up Anne, and I was to tell Anne on the way home that he was a very sick child and that he had 3 hours to live. So we got in and we went into Mount Argus in Dublin. We had friends there. One of them was a priest, and he came in and he baptised Ken. And then at 5 minutes to 12 midnight, a nurse came in and said, "We're sorry, you have to leave now, because for insurance purposes, you can't be on the premises after midnight." So Anne got quite upset, and the nurse went out, and then she came back in then and she said, and by the way, she said, "You can't come and visit on Christmas Day because for insurance purposes, you can't be on the premises." So the priest, Father Gus, as we left, he stuck a little Padre Pio prayer card down between the mattress and the edge of the little cot, So we drove him back to Mount Argus, and Anne is in floods of tears, and she's in the back seat, and Father Gus is beside me, and we pulled into Mount Argus. And as Father Gus gets out of the car, he said to Anne, "This is terrible what's happened, But she said, our ways, God's ways are not our ways." And he said, "If Ken dies, maybe that's God's will. And maybe if he survives, that's God's will." But he said, "What happened to all the people that the Lord healed on earth when he was on earth?" And Anne said, "They're all dead." And Father Gus said, "Well, that's our destiny, is death. So leave it up to God's will. Try and get a night's sleep." And anyway, that was it. Christmas Day, no phone calls, nothing. We went over to my mom's house for Christmas dinner. It was a very difficult Christmas. So we went back home on Christmas night. And then at 7 o'clock the following morning, which was St. Stephen's morning, Anna are at the hospital. And as we're waiting to go in, a nurse comes out and she says, "Oh, of course," she said, "you have a very sick child with cystic fibrosis." And Anne and I looked at one another because they might have told us that he had a head 10 times the size of the building we're in. Hadn't an idea, never heard of the word before. She knew that there was some difficulty, so the professor was rolled out and told us about this illness. So it's a genetic illness. Anne and I are carriers of the gene, and the couple have to be carriers of the gene. And if you are, then there's a possibility that some of the children will be born with cystic fibrosis. Again, like any illness, there are very mild and there are very severe cases. So Ken was sort of in the middle at the time, But he couldn't eat any fatty foods or dairy products. And I remember at one stage Anne feeding him for 11 hours, getting into bed at around about 9 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock the following morning, still giving him the same bottle, and then he just kept vomiting and vomiting and vomiting and vomiting. So he went into hospital, and we had to take him out of there because when we went in on St. Stephen's Day, Ken was at the bottom of his little crib. The thing was all tossed up. There were clothes, a sheet and everywhere. And he was so thin and he was at the bottom of it. And Anne says, my God, wouldn't you think they'd keep a sick child comfortable? So as only moms could do, she picked Ken up with one arm, and then she's looking at the sheet, and there are all these tiny little, we didn't know what they were, but it looked a little bit like cotton wool, and yet it wasn't. It looked like paper, and yet it was. We didn't know what it was. And she took a pillow up and she bet it against her side, buffed it up, put it down, and then she put Ken in, and then she went to fix the sheet, and she was pushing the sheet in between the mattress and the edge of the little cot, and she felt something damp. And she said, oh my God, what's that? So when she pulled out, it was the Padre Pio prayer card. And Ken had obviously put it in his mouth during the night. And obviously he took it out and had it in his fingers. So there were little balls of paper, tiny little balls of paper that he had obviously chewed and just dropped them around the bed. So if you don't mind, I'll bring you forward. I'll come back again, but I want to bring you forward 25 years just to talk about the significance of these little balls of paper. So 25 years later, I'm in America. It's our 25th wedding anniversary. And Anne and I'm invited to a big conference for the Catholic Marketing Network. It was to help with all Catholic, whether it's musicians, authors or writers, to try and promote them. And I was invited along, and my record executive from Boston came with us. And Anne doesn't like to fly, but she said she'd come if I would buy tickets for Ken and for Gary to come. Lorna was already in America. So we bought the tickets and we went over. So we go down to Newark, which is about a 3.5 hour, 4 hour drive from Boston. And we're setting up in the auditorium. At that time, I'd only 2 albums, Let Me Live and You're Always Close to Me. And we were trying to cover an area as big as this with a couple of tables with 2 albums, The Loaves and the Fishes. And directly opposite was a wonderful, beautiful stand for a group of people called Gospel Missions, who was run by a guy called, these old timers I'm going to be suffering with, Tom Rakowski, who was a lay evangelist. Now, Tom had every type of statue you could possibly think of. Our Lady, and they did books, rosaries, you name it, he had it. And Gary, who we at that time used to call the apprentice pagan because he had no interest in God. And Ken really had no interest in God at that stage either. So Ken is sitting against the wall, and he's sitting on a chair, but he's balancing the chair on the 2 back legs, leaning against the wall. And Gary is in looking around the stand, and then all we hear, hey, da, look at the statue of the monk lad. $600. And of course, I couldn't see where he was, So Ken, who was sitting there, Ken says, that's Padre Pio. And I said, how do you know that that's Padre Pio? He said, he came to me when I was sick. So the doctors, Ken was in an oxygen tent for about 2.5 months. One day we went in, and all they kept saying was, it's only a matter of time, scratching the heads, we don't know, all we're feeling is jelly and ice cream. We go in one day, it's all gone, and the doctors are still scratching the head and says, we don't know about this. So Ken came home, but then we shifted him to the Children's Hospital in Crumlin, where it was a much bigger hospital, and it was a lot more care. They were in touch with hospitals all over Europe and the States to try and learn more about cystic fibrosis. But there's no cure for cystic fibrosis. Nowadays, the new drugs can help. Some of them, they can live an extremely normal life. Ken had a double lung transplant in 2001. And that was difficult in the extent of he had to go to Newcastle because they weren't doing transplants in Ireland at the time. So we went to Newcastle, and thank God we didn't have to make the decision, about him having the transplant, because it was brutal. They talked about, if he survives the surgery to remove the old lungs, and then if he survives that and he has the new lungs, he said the statistics say that for 80% live through the first year, 50% through the second year, and we don't have any statistics after that. So we're saying, why would you put yourself through this if it's as brutal as they say it was? Why would we put him through? But he decided, I'll go for it. So we got a call. He got a call in on the 26th of November 2001, and he went over with Anne and his sister, and he had the surgery. The young boy who died was from Donegal. His name was Morris. Morris was 20 years of age, and Morris developed meningitis and passed away. So the parents made a wonderful gesture of allowing his organs to be donated. So Ken received the double lung transplant, and he was to stay 6 weeks in hospital. But after 4 weeks, he just took to this thing, new lungs, the procedures, all the things that he had to do when he got home, took to them like a duck to water. And on Christmas Eve morning, they told us this, and we've booked flights for you to go home. But he said there's a little bit of rejection at the moment. So she said we'll up the anti-rejection drug, and then we'll do some blood tests lunchtime. So they came in at lunchtime and said, we've sorted it, you can go home. So we flew home with 3 hours notice, and when we arrived home, we had a limousine to take us to the house. And I live in Tala in Balrother. It's a lovely little estate. And as we turned into our road, every tree had a big yellow ribbon tied around it. And when we got to the front of the house, they had a big banner hanging out from the window, "Welcome home, Ken, and your new lungs."
Wow.
And then on the following day, Father Ben came down that evening when he heard we were home, because he had baptised Ken as a toddler. And the joy in the house. And while we were in talking, at the certain what I could hear was somebody up the stairs, down the stairs, and then I heard a thump. And then I ran out, and it's Ken. I said, "Ken, what are you doing? You're running up and down the stairs and jumping. What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" He said, "Because I can." Because he could.
Because I can.
And he was normal, as he said, because I remember making a statement to him one day when he was very bad, and I said to him, "God, Ken, I'd give you anything, I could to make you better." And he says, "Dad, I know no better. I don't know anything but the way I am. I was born with this, So I said, "God." So after his transplant, he was 2 weeks in the hospital, and then they moved him out to the nurses' pavilion because they wanted to see could he cope on his own. So he was self-medicating and all that, So we had to go back in after the second week for an X-ray or something. So we went in, he had the X-ray, and then we're walking back through the compound of the hospital. And Newcastle in November, it was freezing. I mean, you'd nearly wanted 2 jackets on you. So when we were with Ken before the surgery, you followed Ken. So Ken would walk maybe 10 paces, and then he would stop and he'd go, and then he'd move on, and then we'd move on after him. When he stopped, we just stopped. So that was the procedure. So we were still sort of following this procedure after his surgery when we're walking through, and then he stopped suddenly. And Anne and I looked at one another, and the thought was, "Oh God, what's gone wrong? Is he suffering?" And then we had to wear masks at that stage, a bit like went through COVID. And when he stopped, he just picked up his mask and he went, and we could see his breath vaporizing. And then he turned to me and he said, "Now I know what you meant, Dad." So he was normal.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Join me at the same time next week when I'll continue my chat with David. For now, good night and God bless.